Okay, 23. I just don't understand, the tuba said mid-morning after several hours of searching for Saeed and Dieter. No one understood. No one responded. The disappearances were incomprehensible. They could find no trace. The symphony searched in teams of 4, grimly, methodically, but the forest was dense and choked with underbrush. They could have passed within feet of Dieter and Saeed and not known it. In those first hours, there were moments when Kirsten caught herself thinking that there must have simply been some misunderstanding, that Dieter and Saeed must have somehow walked by them in the dark, somehow gone the wrong way down the road, that they'd reappear with apologies at any moment. But scouts had gone back and forth on the road for miles. Again and again, Kirsten stopped still in the forest, listening. Was someone watching her? Just now, had someone stepped on a branch? But the only sounds were of the other search teams, and everyone felt watched. They met in the forest and on the road at intervals, looked at one another, and said nothing. The slow passage of the sun across the sky, the air over the road unsteady with heat waves. When night began to fall, they gathered by the lead caravan, which had once been an extended bed Ford pickup truck. Because survival is insufficient. Words painted on the canopy in answer to the question that had dogged the symphony since they'd set out on the road. The words were very white in the rising evening. Kirsten stood by Dieter's favorite horse, Bernstein, and pressed her hand flat against his side. He stared at her with an enormous dark eye. We have traveled so far together, the conductor said. There are certain qualities of light that blur the years. Sometimes when Kirsten and August were on watch together at dawn, she could glance at him as the sun rose, and for a fleeting instant, she could see what he'd looked like as a boy. Here on this road, the conductor looked much older than she had an hour earlier. She ran a hand through her short gray hair. There have been 4 times, she said, in all these years when symphony members have become separated from the symphony, and in every single instance they have followed the separation protocol, and we've been reunited at the destination. Alexandra? Yes? Will you state the separation protocol, please? It had been drilled into all of them. We never travel without a destination, Alexandra said. If you're ever separated from the symphony on the road, you make your way to the destination and wait. And what is the current destination? The Museum of Civilization in the Severn City Airport. Yes. The conductor was quiet, looking at them. The forest was in shadow now, but there was still some light in the corridor of sky above the road, the last pink of sunset streaking the clouds. I have been on the road for 15 years, she said, and Saeed's been with me for 12, Dieter for even longer. He was with me in the beginning, Gil said. We walked out of Chicago together. I leave neither of them willingly. The conductor's eyes were shining. But I won't risk the rest of you by staying here a day longer. That night, they kept a double watch, teams of 4 instead of 2, and set out before dawn the following morning. The air was damp between the walls of the forest. The clouds marbled overhead, a scent of pine in the air. Kirsten walked by the first caravan, trying to think of nothing. A sense of being caught in a terrible dream. They stopped at the end of the afternoon. The fevered summers of this century, this impossible heat. The lake glittered through the trees. This had been one of those places that wasn't quite suburbia, but wasn't quite not, an in-between district where the houses stood on wooded lots. They were within 3 days of the airport now. Kirsten sat on a log with her head in her hands, thinking, Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? And no one bothered her until August came to sit nearby. I'm sorry, he said. I think they were taken, she said without raising her head, and I can't stop thinking about what the prophet was saying in St. Deborah. That thing about the light? I don't think I heard it. I was packing up. They call themselves the light. What about it? If you are the light, she said, then your enemies are darkness, right? I suppose. If you are the light, if your enemies are darkness, then there's nothing that you cannot justify. There's nothing you can't survive, because there's nothing that you will not do. He sighed. We can only remain hopeful, he said. We have to assume that the situation will become more clear. But 4 teams set out in search of dinner, and only 3.5 returned. I turned and she was gone, Jackson said of Sidney, the clarinet. He'd returned to the camp alone and shaken. They'd found a stream, Jackson said, about a quarter mile down the road in the direction from which they'd come. He'd knelt on the bank to fill the water container, and when he looked up, she had vanished. Had she fallen in? No, he said. He would have heard a splash, and he was downstream, so she would have passed him. It was a small stream, and the banks weren't steep. There was just the woods all around him, a sense of being watched. He called her name, but she was nowhere. He noticed then that the bird song had stopped. The woods had gone still. No one spoke for a moment when he'd finished telling the story. The symphony gathered close around him. "Where's Olivia?" Lynn asked suddenly. Olivia was in the back of the first caravan, playing with a rag doll. "I want you in my sight," Lynn whispered. "Not just within sight, within reach. Do you understand?" She was close with Dieter, the first oboe said. This was true, and they were all silent, thinking of the clarinet and searching their memories for clues. Had she seemed like herself lately? None of them were sure. What did it mean to seem like yourself in the course of such unspeakable days? How was anyone supposed to seem? "Are we being hunted?" Alexandra asked. It seemed plausible. Kirsten looked over her shoulder into the shadows of the trees. A search party was organized, but the light was gone. Lighting a fire seemed too dangerous, so they ate dinner from the preserved food stores, rabbit jerky and dried apples, and settled in for an uneasy night. In the morning, they delayed for 5 hours, searching, but they couldn't find her. They set off into another searing day. Is it logical that they could have all been taken? August was walking beside Kirsten. Dieter, Saeed, the clarinet. How could anyone overpower them so silently? There was a lump in her throat. It was difficult to speak. Maybe they just left. Abandoned us? Yes. Why would they? I don't know. Later in the day, someone thought to search the clarinet's belongings and found the note. The beginning of a letter. "Dear friends, I find myself immeasurably weary, and I have gone to rest in the forest." It ended there. The date suggested that earlier it had been written 11 months earlier. The date suggested that either it had been written 11 months earlier, or that the clarinet didn't know what year or month it was, or one or the other. Neither scenario was unlikely. This was an era when exact dates were seldom relevant, and keeping track required a degree of dedication. The note had been folded and refolded several times, soft along the creases. "It seems more theoretical than anything," the first cello said. "Like she wrote it a year ago and then changed her mind? It doesn't prove anything." "That's assuming she wrote it a year ago," said Lynn. "She could have written it last week. I think it shows suicidal intent." "Where were we a year ago? Does anyone remember?" "Mackinac City," August said. "New Petoskey, East Jordan, all those little places down the coast on the way to New Sarnia." "I don't remember her seeming different a year ago," Lynn said. "Was she sad?" No one was sure. They all felt they should have been paying more attention. Still, the scouts reported no one behind or ahead of them on the road. Impossible not to imagine that they were being watched from the forest. What was the symphony without Dieter and the clarinet and Saeed? Kirsten had thought of Dieter as a sort of older brother, she realized. Perhaps a cousin, a fixture in her life and in the life of the symphony. It seemed in some abstract way impossible that the symphony continued without him. She had never been close with the clarinet, but the clarinet was conspicuous in her absence. She only spoke with Saeed to argue with him now, but the thought of him having come to harm was sheer agony. Her breath was shallow in her chest, and the tears were silent and constant. Late in the day, she found a folded piece of paper in her pocket. She recognized August's handwriting. "A fragment for my friend. If your soul left this earth, I would follow and find you, silent, my starship suspended in night." She'd never seen his poetry before and was impossibly moved by it. "Thank you," she said when she saw him next. He nodded. The land became wilder. The houses subsided. They had to stop 3 times to clear fallen trees. They used 2-handed saws, working as quickly as possible with sweat soaking through their clothes. Scouts posted here and there, watching the road and the forest, jumping and aiming their weapons at small sounds. Kirsten and August walked out ahead over the conductor's objections. A half-mile beyond the stalled caravans, they came upon a rolling plain. "A golf course," August said. "You know what that means." They'd found 2 full bottles of scotch and a can of miraculously still edible cocktail olives in a golf course clubhouse once, and August had been trying to replicate the experience ever since. The clubhouse was at the end of a long driveway, obscured behind a bank of trees. It was burnt out, the roof draped like fabric from the 3 remaining walls. Golf carts were toppled over on their sides in the grass. The sky was darkening now, and it was hard to see much of the clubhouse interior in the pre-storm light, just glints of shattered glass where the windows had been. Too dangerous to go in with the roof half fallen. On the far side, they found a small man-made lake with a rotted pier, a flicker of movement under the surface. They walked back to the caravans for the fishing equipment. The first and third cellos were sawing at the last fallen tree. Back at the golf course pond, there were so many fish that it was possible to catch them with the net alone, scooping them up from the overcrowded water. The fish were small, brownish things, unpleasant to the touch. Thunder in the distance, and then a short time later, the first drops of rain. August, who carried his instrument at all times, wrapped his violin case in a plastic sheet he kept in his bag. They worked through the downpour, Kirsten dragging the net through the water, August gutting and cleaning. He knew she couldn't stand to gut fish. Something she'd seen on the road that first year out of Toronto, a fleeting impression of some vision that she couldn't exactly remember, but that made her ill when she tried to consider it. And he'd always been kind about it. She could hardly see him through the rain. For a moment, it was possible to forget that 3 people were missing. When the storm at last subsided, they filled the net with fish and carried it back along the driveway. Steam was rising from the road. They found the place where the fallen trees had been cut and pulled off the road, but the symphony had departed. They must have passed by on the road while we were fishing, August said. It was the only reasonable conclusion. They had confirmed the route with the conductor before they'd returned to the golf course with a fishing net. The pond had been far enough off the road that they wouldn't have seen the symphony, hidden as they were behind the clubhouse, and the sound of the symphony's passing would have been lost in the storm. They moved fast, Kirsten said, but her stomach was clenched, and August was jingling the handful of change in his pocket. It didn't add up. Why would the symphony travel in a downpour? Unless there was some unexpected emergency. The storm had washed the road clear of tracks, leaves and twigs in swirling patterns over the pavement, and the heat was rising again. The sky had a broken-apart look about it now, patches of blue between the clouds. The fish will go bad fast in this heat, August said. This was a quandary. Every cell in Kirsten's body ached to follow the symphony, but it was safer to light a fire in daylight, and they'd eaten nothing but a strip or two each of rabbit jerky that morning. They gathered wood for a fire, but of course everything was wet and it took a long time to spark even the slightest flame. The fire smoked badly, their eyes stinging while they cooked, but at least the smoke replaced the stench of fish from their clothes. They ate as much fish as they could and carried the rest with them in the net, set off half sick down the road, past the golf course, past a number of houses that had obviously been ransacked years earlier, ruined furniture strewn about on the lawns. After a while, they jettisoned the fish, it was turning in the heat, and sped up, walking as quickly as possible. But the symphony was still out of sight, and surely by now there should have been some sign of them, hoofprints, or footprints, or wheel marks on the road. They didn't speak. Near twilight, the road crossed under a highway. Kirsten climbed up to the overpass for a vantage point, hoping that the symphony might perhaps be just ahead, but the road curved toward the distant shine of the lake and disappeared behind the trees. The highway was miles of permanent gridlock, small trees growing now between cars and thousands of windshields reflecting the sky. There was a skeleton in the driver's seat of the nearest car. They slept under a tree near the overpass, side by side on top of August's plastic sheet. Kirsten slept fitfully, aware each time she woke of the emptiness of the landscape, the lack of people and animals and caravans around her. Hell is the absence of people you long for. 24. On their second day without the symphony, Kirsten and August came upon a line of cars, queued along the shoulder of the road. It was late morning and the heat was rising, a hush falling over the landscape. They'd lost sight of the lake. The cars cast curved shadows. They'd been cleaned out, no bones in back seats or abandoned belongings, which suggested someone lived near here and traveled this route. An hour later, they reached a gas station, a low building alone by the road with a yellow seashell sign still standing, vehicles crowded and blocking one another at the pumps. One was the color of melted butter, black lettering on the side. A Chicago taxicab, Kirsten realized. Someone in the very final days had hailed one of the last taxis in the rioting city, negotiated a price, and fled north. 2 neat bullet holes in the driver's side door. A dog barked, and they froze, their hands on their weapons. The man who came around the side of the building with a golden retriever was in his 50s or 60s, gray hair cut very short, and a stiff way of moving that suggested an old injury, a rifle held at his side. He had a complicated scar on his face. "Help you?" he asked. His tone wasn't unfriendly, and this was the pleasure of being alive near 20, this calmer age. For the first 10 or 12 years after the collapse, he would have been much more likely to shoot them on sight. "Just passing through," Kirsten said. "We mean no harm. We're headed for the Museum of Civilization." "Headed where now?" "The Severn City Airport." August was silent beside her. He didn't like to speak to strangers. The man nodded. "Anyone still out there?" "We're hoping our friends are there." You lose them? Yes, Kirsten said. We lost them. August sighed. The absence of the symphony from this route had been obvious for some time. They had passed over patches of soft earth with no tracks, no horse manure, no recent wheel ruts or footprints, no sign at all that 20-odd people, 3 caravans, and 7 horses were ahead of them on this road. Well, the man shook his head. Bad luck. Sorry to hear that. I'm Finn, by the way. I'm Kirsten. This is August. That a violin case? Finn asked. Yes. You run away from an orchestra? They ran away from us, Kirsten said quickly, because she saw the way August's fist clenched in his pocket. You here alone? Of course not, Finn said, and Kirsten realized her error. Even in this calmer era, who would admit to being outnumbered? His gaze rested on Kirsten's knives. She was finding it difficult not to stare at the scar on the side of his face. Hard to tell at this distance, but it seemed like a deliberate pattern. But this isn't a town. No, I wouldn't call it that. Sorry, just curious. We don't come across too many like you, like me, living outside of town, Kirsten said. Oh, well, it's quiet out here. This place you mentioned, he said, this museum. You know anything about it? Not really, Kirsten said, but our friends were going there. I heard it's supposed to be a place where artifacts from the old world are preserved, August said. The man laughed, a sound like a bark. His dog looked up at him with an expression of concern. Artifacts from the old world, he said. Here's the thing, kids. The entire world is a place where artifacts from the old world are preserved. When was the last time you saw a new car? They glanced at one another. Well, anyway, Finn said, there's a pump behind the building if you'd like to fill your water bottles. They thanked him and followed him back. Behind the gas station were 2 small children, red-headed twins of 8 or 9 years old and indeterminate gender, peeling potatoes. They were barefoot, but their clothes were clean, their hair neatly trimmed, and they stared at the strangers as they approached. Kirsten found herself wondering, as she always did when she saw children, if it was better or worse to have never known any world except the one after the Georgia flu. Finn pointed to a hand pump on the pedestal in the dirt. We've met, Kirsten said, haven't we? Weren't you in St. Deborah by the Water 2 years ago? I remember little twins with red hair following me around town when I went out for a walk. Finn tensed, and she saw in the twitch of his arm that he was on the point of raising his rifle. Did the prophet send you? What? No, it's nothing like that. We've only passed through that town. We got out as fast as we could, August said. We're with the traveling symphony. Finn smiled. Well, that explains the violin, he said. I remember the symphony all right. He relaxed his grip on the rifle. The moment passed. Can't say I was ever much for Shakespeare, but that was the best music I'd heard in years. Thank you, August said. You leave town after the prophet took over? Kirsten asked. August was working the pump while Kirsten held their bottles under the spout, cool water splashing her hand. Craziest damn people I ever met in my life, he said. Dangerous as hell. A few of us took our kids and fled. Did you know Charlie and Jeremy? Kirsten recapped the bottles, put them away in her knapsack and August's bag. Musicians, weren't they? She was black, he was Asian? Yes. Not well. I knew them to say hello. They left with their baby a few days before I did. You know where they went? No idea. Can you tell us what's down the road? Nothing for miles. Couple of abandoned towns. No one there anymore so far as I know. After that, just Severn City and the lake. Have you been there? They were walking back to the road. Kirsten glanced at the side of the man's face, and the scar snapped into focus. A lowercase t with an extra line. The symbol she'd seen spray-painted on buildings in St. Deborah by the Water. Severn City? Not since the collapse. What's it like? Kirsten asked. Living out here. Outside of a town. Quiet, Finn shrugged. I wouldn't have risked it 8 or 10 years ago, but except for the prophet, it's been a very quiet decade. He hesitated. Look, I wasn't quite straight with you before. I know the place you're talking about, the museum. Supposed to be a fair number of people there. You weren't tempted to go there yourself when you left St. Deborah? The prophet's supposedly from there, he said. Those people at the airport? What if they're the prophet's people? Kirsten and August walked mostly in silence. A deer crossed the road ahead and paused to look at them before it vanished into the trees. The beauty of this world where almost everyone was gone. If hell is other people, what is a world with almost no people in it? Perhaps soon humanity would simply flicker out. But Kirsten found this thought more peaceful than sad. So many species had appeared and later vanished from this earth. What was one more? How many people were even left now? His scar, August said. I know. And where's the symphony? Why would they change the route? August didn't answer. There were a dozen reasons why the symphony might have deviated from the planned route. They were threatened in some way and decided to take a less direct path. They decided upon closer consideration that another route was quicker and expected Kirsten and August to meet them at the airport. They took a wrong turn and vanished into the landscape. August found a driveway in the early afternoon. They'd been resting in the shade when he rose and walked across the road. Kirsten had noticed the stand of young trees there, but had been too tired and heat-stunned to consider what it might mean. August dropped to one knee to prod at the ground. Gravel, he said. It was a driveway, so overgrown that it had nearly disappeared. The forest opened into a clearing with a 2-story house. 2 rusted-out cars and a pickup truck slumped on the remains of their tires. They waited a while at the edge of the trees, watching, but detected no movement. The front door was locked, an unusual detail. They circled the house, but the back door was locked too. Kirsten picked the lock. It was obvious from the moment they stepped into the living room. No one else had been here. Throw pillows were arranged neatly on the sofa. A remote control lay on the coffee table, blurred by dust. They looked at one another with eyebrows identically raised over the rags they'd tied over their faces. They hadn't come across an untouched house in years. In the kitchen, Kirsten ran her finger over the row of plates in the dish rack, took a few forks for later use. Upstairs, there was a room that had once belonged to a child. The child in question was still present, a husk in the bed. Kirsten pulled a quilt over its head, while August was still going through the downstairs bathroom. And there was a framed photograph on the wall of a boy with his parents, all of them beaming and resplendent with life. The boy in the Little League uniform with his parents kneeling on either side. She heard August's footsteps behind her. "Look what I found," he said. He'd found a metal Starship Enterprise. He held it up in the sunlight, a gleaming thing the size of a dragonfly. That was when Kirsten noticed the poster of the solar system above the bed. Earth, a small blue dot near the sun. The boy had loved both baseball and space. "We should keep moving," Kirsten said after a moment. August's gaze had fallen to the bed. She left the room first so he could say one of his prayers, although she wasn't actually sure if prayer was the right word for it. When he murmured over the dead, he seemed to be talking only to them. "I hope it was peaceful at the end," she'd heard him say. Or, "You have a really nice house. I'm sorry for taking your boots." Or, "Wherever you are, I hope your family's there too." To the child in the bed, he spoke so quietly that Kirsten couldn't hear. The only words she caught were, "Up in the stars." And she moved quickly on to the master bedroom so that he wouldn't catch her eavesdropping. But she saw that August had been there already. The boy's parents had died in their bed, and a cloud of dust hung in the air above them from when August had pulled up the blankets to cover their faces. In the ensuite bathroom, Kirsten closed her eyes for just a second as she flipped the light switch. Naturally, nothing happened, but as always in these moments, she found herself straining to remember what it had been like when this motion had worked. Walk into a room, flip a switch, and the room floods with light. The trouble was, she wasn't sure if she remembered or only imagined remembering this. She ran her fingertips over a blue and white china box on the bathroom counter, admired the rows of Q-tips inside before she pocketed them. Then they looked useful for cleaning ears and musical instruments. Kirsten looked up and met her own gaze in the mirror. She needed a haircut. She smiled, then adjusted her smile to lessen the obviousness of her most recently missing tooth. She opened a cabinet and stared at a stack of clean towels. The one on top was blue with yellow ducks on it and had a hood sewn into the corner. Why hadn't the parents taken the boy into their bed if they'd all been sick together? Perhaps the parents had died first? She didn't want to think about it. The door to the spare bedroom had been closed. The window open a crack, so the carpet was ruined, but the clothes in the closet had escaped the smell of death. She found a dress she liked, soft blue silk with pockets, and changed into it while August was still in the boys' bedroom. There was also a wedding gown and a black suit. She took these for costumes. What the symphony was doing, what they were always doing, was trying to cast a spell, and costuming helped. The lives they brushed up against were work-worn and difficult, people who spent all their time engaged in the tasks of survival. A few of the actors thought Shakespeare would be more relatable if they dressed in the same patched and faded clothing their audience wore, but Kirsten thought it meant something to see Titania in a gown, Hamlet in a shirt and tie. The tuba agreed with her. The thing with the New World, the tuba had said once, is it's just horrifically short on elegance. He knew something about elegance. He had played in a military orchestra with the conductor before the collapse. He talked sometimes about the military balls. Where was he? Don't think of the symphony. Don't think of the symphony. There is only here, she told herself. There is only this house. Nice dress, August said, when she found him downstairs in the living room. The old one smelled like smoke and fish guts. I found a couple suitcases in the basement, he said. They left with a suitcase each, towels and clothing and a stack of magazines that Kirsten wanted to go through later, an unopened box of salt from the kitchen, and various other items that they thought they might use. But first, Kirsten lingered for a few minutes in the living room, scanning the bookshelves while August searched for a TV guide or poetry. You looking for something in particular? He asked after she'd given up the search. She could see he was thinking of taking the remote. He'd been holding it and idly pressing all the buttons. Dr. Levin, obviously, but I'd settle for Dear V. The latter was a book she'd somehow misplaced on the road 2 or 3 years ago, and she'd been trying ever since to find a replacement. The book had belonged to her mother, purchased just before the end of everything. Dear V, an unauthorized portrait of Arthur Leander. White text across the top proclaimed the book's status as a #1 bestseller. The cover photo was black and white, Arthur looking over his shoulder as he got into a car. The look on his face could have meant anything. A little haunted, perhaps, but it was equally possible that someone had just called his name, and he was turning to look at him or her. The book was comprised entirely of letters written to a friend, the anonymous V. When Kirsten had left Toronto with her brother, he'd told her she could bring one book in her backpack, just one. So she'd taken Dear V, because her mother had told her she wasn't allowed to read it. Her brother had raised an eyebrow, but made no remark.